Okay, last day of the week, we're going to talk about minerals. So you're getting just a kind of a little brief beginning of an idea about what vitamins and minerals and essential fatty acids can do for you. It's an introduction. If you think about how many hours we spent this week talking about these very basics of nutrition and how little you know if you're just going to base it on what you've learned this week. And then recognize that a lot of medical school training does not include much more than this, and probably not pointed toward the psychology, probably just in more general terms. Then you can recognize how little our culture seems to value the basic nutrition and how we overvalue pharmaceuticals. Again, I am not saying that pharmaceuticals have zero value. They definitely have their place and in many cases can be very useful. However, we cannot skip over basic nutrition, sleep, exercise, and water in favor of using pharmaceuticals first. I think that it doesn't make any sense to ignore what the body is telling you. There's this saying, listen to the body whispers before you have to listen to the body's screams. And I like that saying. I like it a lot. That's what I would encourage all of us to do, is start to remember, how can I listen to what my body is whispering to me instead of having it, instead of having to wait for it to be screaming at me before I will listen. All right, so let's finish today by talking a little bit about minerals. What do you need to know about minerals? Like, really, if you think about, what do you know already? What do you know about minerals? Probably not a lot. We've heard of calcium. People talk about how important calcium is. If you want to get into this even further, you can look at calcium and magnesium and potassium and the balance between those and other minerals that, in our typical cultural way of more is better. If it looks like it might be a problem, just raise your level, just throw stuff at it. What I want to again emphasize that this is about balance, and it is a more complex issue. It's not like, oh, you're low in calcium, therefore take lots of extra calcium. The calcium you're taking may not be the calcium that works for you, may not actually increase the level of calcium in your body. It may create other problems because it's just coming all at once as calcium instead of in the package. So the history of understanding minerals is kind of an interesting history because we completely dismiss it as a bunch of ridiculousness. And so the word alchemy, people roll their eyes and they think of fantasy novels, or, wow, were there really people that did alchemy? They really thought they could turn lead into gold. How dumb were they? That's about the extent of what we understand. Yet alchemy, as it was practiced, was the beginning of people really understanding minerals and understanding how can you purify them and how do they act when you're combined, when they are combined. And then another idea to just kind of deepen this, our propensity to just dismiss things, the whole lead turning into gold silliness. Well, there are some ideas that, lead could be symbolic of humanity, of mortality, turning the mortal human character into gold or spiritual perfection. And that could have been one of the aims of alchemists. And as kind of in a symbolic way, they were working on minerals, but it was more of a spiritual, I can't think of the word, just wish, some word, pick a word, give it to me. All right, minerals from the earth. Think about this like a really bottom-up process. Starting with the beginning of the earth, you have the earth's core, that liquid core at the very center of the earth, all the way out onto land and in the sea bottoms. Minerals are part of the earth. and they have to do with reaction from the sun, etc. And so you have these minerals that are from the earth, and they are there on the earth crusts. They're dissolved into the sea as salts. And so I'm not just talking about sea salt, I'm talking about seawater as a whole, having these salts in it. Seawater contains 65 minerals. 65 minerals. So it's not just sodium chloride, it's not just salt, it's 65 minerals. A lot of times you've probably heard how seawater has been compared to the blood of the body in terms of its structure and mineral content, etc. And you can kind of think of that as a fun analogy. Sea plants will assimilate the minerals in the seawater. They assimilate them and then they concentrate them. And so they're in a different concentration in the plant than they are in the seawater. They concentrate them, they balance them one with another, so that animals that eat the sea plants benefit maximally from those minerals. On land, instead of having sea plants, because obviously you're on land, the same kind of function, though, is taken care of by bacteria and mycelium. So mycelium is the same, it's like the precursor for fungi. And so you have mushrooms that grow in the ground, and they're not just the mushroom. You can think of an apple tree and an apple. So the apple is the fruit of the apple tree, but it's the whole tree that you need. Same thing with mushrooms. The mushroom is kind of like the fruit of the mycelium. Mycelium is this network that is under the soil that is vast, amazing. You can have huge mycelial networks that are just they're incredibly large. Anyway, mycelium, one of the things that they do is they break down minerals and they make them available to plants. So mycelium have this really amazing relationship with plants where they give plants minerals and they take from plants some of the products of photosynthesis so that the mycelium can survive. And so the mycelium and plants have this great relationship where they both need each other. They both need each other. And so when you plant plants, you don't want to break up the mycelium very much, because then it will take longer for your plants to be established and grow in soil that doesn't have any mycelium. So anyway, one of the things that bacteria and mycelium do then is they break down minerals from the earth and feed them to the plant. And then the plant can assimilate them and balance them and concentrate them. And so just like sea plants, land plants can do the same thing thanks to availability of minerals through bacteria and mycelium. And so these plant minerals are concentrated and balanced for animals to eat and benefit from. They're different from ground up rocks. A lot of times what you buy in the drugstore, if you want to buy minerals, are ground up rocks. And you're missing out on the mineral being broken down by bacterium or mycelium and then entered into the plant and balanced and concentrated in a plant so that it is much more perfectly bioavailable as compared to powder from rocks. So keep that in mind as you look at minerals, finding some ways to get plant minerals into your body. I'm suggesting eating plants. You may have noticed that up to this point. Eating plants is really a good plan. It is so much more direct and so much cheaper than trying to replace eating plants with the drugstore. In humans, minerals act as catalysts for enzyme reactions. That's one of the major things they do. We have a gazillion, that's a specific word, right? A specific number of enzyme-based reactions that run our bodies all the time. And minerals will act as catalysts for this. Processed food removes a lot of minerals from our foods. And then we start to feel yucky. And we're like, well, all that I have the energy for is ordering pizza. That's all I've got. And so I'm helpless. But what we have to see is that you can't magically get minerals from nothing. You have to go out and get them and get yourself to start eating some plants that are really healthy and useful. and good sources of not only all the other vitamins that we've talked about, and omega-3 fatty acids. Plants are a good source of omega-3 fatty acids, but also minerals. Incidentally, omega-3 fatty acids, I think we talked about flax and chia and sea buckthorn and hemp as great sources of those things. So if you're looking at nutrient-dense plants or nutrient-dense eating, what you're looking at as in the same amount of food, you can have high levels of nutrients or low levels of nutrients. And it's always in your best interest to choose high levels of nutrients. So minerals are one of those nutrients you want to look at, and what you really need are plant minerals. So they will act as catalysts, helping with enzyme reactions. They also provide structural material, like when you think of strong bones, calcium, right? They also allow electrical impulses to travel your nerves. And so if you think about maybe what you learned in Intro to Psychology about sodium-potassium channels that allow for the neurons to fire in the brain. If you don't have enough sodium or potassium, this can be troublesome. One of the jobs of your adrenal glands is to help regulate your level of sodium in the blood. And so if you don't have enough sodium, your adrenal glands have to work much, much harder to try and regulate that amount. And it can be tough on your adrenals to have a very, very low sodium diet. I'm not saying go out and eat a bunch of really bad salt and greasy food. I'm saying plant minerals are really a great plan. Without them, nothing works. So there's 4 elements that are the building blocks of life. You have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Then you've got 75 elements that can be classified as minerals. And of those 75 minerals, 31 have a known biological role. Probably the others have some sort of a role that we haven't identified yet. So again, I am not interested in saying that they are all just random accidents filler of the universe. The major minerals are considered calcium, chlorine, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, and sulfur. These are major minerals that you need more of than what we call trace minerals. They're trace minerals because you need just a trace, like parts per million in the rest of these things. The trace minerals are still really, really important. So you still need to make sure that they're included, but if you have good plants that grew in good soil that has minerals in it, then you're doing pretty well. You're in pretty good shape. Plants like alfalfa, for example, that have a very, very, very long taproot. They're going way far into the earth and able to bring up more minerals than your average plant that maybe doesn't go very far in the earth or is just grown in this kind of inert nothing without much nutrition. So look at a variety of plants, including some plants with long taproots. Here are some potentially toxic minerals that, depending on the dose, they are toxic. Mercury, we know there's no level of mercury that is beneficial. There, even small, teeny tiny doses can be a real problem. All right, let's talk just a little bit about specifically magnesium and I'm going to mention potassium and some mental illness issues. So magnesium is something that we ignore primarily. We think a lot in our culture about making sure we have enough calcium, but we don't really think a lot about having enough magnesium or enough potassium, even though those two are very, very, very important. And what we see in people with mental illness is that magnesium is an issue. So specifically for bipolar disorder, patients with untreated bipolar disorder, what they find is that during manic episodes, there's a big decrease in intracellular magnesium and in plasma levels of zinc. So intracellular, what we're talking about is inside the cell, inside the red blood cells usually. So inside the cell is what we're looking at, not in the blood. So people will go get a blood test for magnesium and they'll look at their blood level of magnesium, and that is different than looking at your intracellular level of magnesium. It's a different test. And so what we tend to do is, again, when we simplify and reduce everything to the basics, we're like, oh, let's just see how much magnesium I have. I guess I can find that out by measuring how much is in my blood. That is not necessarily how much magnesium you have or that it's in the right place. And so it needs to be in the cell. That's where you really want your magnesium. Interestingly, the medications that are typical for bipolar disorder, BAD is it's a bad abbreviation, I know, right? The typical medication, things like carbamazepine and valproic acid, you might know as Depakote, and lithium. Actually, did I forget? Oh, yeah, lithium's there also. So these medications tend to increase intracellular magnesium and plasma zinc. Interesting, right? Interesting that these mood modulators all have a different action in terms of how they believe they modulate mood, yet they all seem to increase intracellular magnesium. Kind of similar to a number of different treatments for depression, like probiotics, exercise, sleep, and some antidepressants. And my mind's blanking on a couple other, vitamin D, for sure, vitamin D. All of these things are anti-inflammatory. And so the anti-inflammatory action we know is helpful for depression. And interestingly, a number of different ways of treating depression seem to decrease inflammation. Since processing foods reduces magnesium, it makes a cultural problem happen. As a nation, we are probably pretty deficient in magnesium in addition to vitamin D. And interestingly, both of those things together are implicated in things like asthma, etc. So magnesium deficiency actually causes injury to the neurons and brain dysfunction, which can lead to depression. In suicidal and treatment-resistant patients, when they see treatment-resistant, it makes it sound like it's about the person, and it's not about the person. It's about the doctor. It's like the doctor can't figure out what medication will help you. And so they're like, the problem is I can't find the medication that will work. So I'm going to call it treatment-resistant depression. Okay, so you can all roll your eyes at that and be like, wow, okay. But that's what they're talking about. Treatment-resistant patients who are suicidal have low magnesium when you measure it as in their cerebral spinal fluid. It didn't mention what their intracellular levels were. Those may not have been explored. 1921, so this was like 100 years ago, right? There was a trial of magnesium treatment for agitated depression. Showed success in 220 out of 250 cases. Well, you might think, I don't know, you might think, why don't we do that now? It could be money. It could be that you can't patent magnesium. It could be related to that. I don't know for sure, but it's a possibility. 2008 randomized control trial. Magnesium was as effective as imipramine. Imipramine is one of the older tricyclic antidepressants, kind of like before the 1980s. So that's a thing. And they've shown that intravenous, IV, blood, and by mouth, both of these can rapidly reduce depression without side effects. So again, you might wonder, why is this not a really common treatment? Why don't we all know this? Well, it's because the narrative has been stolen. The narrative is it's a brain chemistry imbalance, right? That's what the narrative is. You know, forget the fact that there's no real data that supports that narrative. That's what we've all been told. And so we have to swallow this idea, which is not accurate, that I have a brain chemistry problem. Well, maybe you do have a brain chemistry problem. It might be about magnesium, potassium, sodium, major minerals, nutrients in plants, vitamins, etc. There is also an association between potassium and the body. Potassium and depression. High potassium diets can relieve depression. When you look at the urine and you're seeing a lot of excretion of sodium and potassium, that seems to be associated with depression. Low levels associated with depression. So if you have low potassium, you may think that there's something wrong with you. Well, I mean, there is something wrong with you. You have low potassium. It is a problem. But what happens is you may go off and try and think, you may go, what am I trying to say? You might get treatment that is not focused on minerals. It might be focused on something bigger, or let's give you a bunch of medication for something that really needs to be solved by potassium. So excessive thirst, muscle weakness, constipation, heart palpitations, arrhythmias, dizziness, it might just be low potassium. And so how can you increase your level of potassium? Well, that might be a good little investigative thing you could do. What foods are high in potassium? You know, just quick internet search will give you a number of foods that are high in potassium. And then how can you incorporate potassium-rich, magnesium-rich foods in your diet? It takes a little bit more effort to put those in the diet. We'll talk about that in a sec. I thought it was extraordinarily relevant time-wise. Like literally last night, I ran across this article. I don't really read Psychology Today. It's like pop psychology, but there are some things that are of value. It's actually a little more valuable than it used to be. It used to be worse. But anyway, I run across this article last night that says why nutrition might be the best antidepressant. And of course, I'm like, well, yes. It's nice to see that this is even making it to Psychology Today. And so they talk about omega-3s, vitamin C, magnesium, and then one of the medicinal herbs we're going to talk about, turmeric, which contains curcumin. Curcumin is great anti-inflammatory. These particular compounds can ward off and reverse inflammation that sparks depression. So the take-home message is this: prioritize good nutrition. That is really so much more useful than almost anything else you could do. Good nutrition. Poor nutrition can be the cause of some mental disorders. See, I'm being really cautious here. I think it's, you could say it could be a partial cause, cautious, but it should definitely take priority in treatment. Instead of being written off as, well, you should eat right, try to eat better. That's all you say about it. And here's this medication. Or not even saying anything because you assume that your patients won't go to the trouble of eating better. If people understand how relevant this is, how critical it is, and then how if you eat better, you're not getting those terrible, awful side effects. No, you don't have that list that you hear on the television when you listen to commercials. Vitamin D, omega-3, B12, these are a challenge. Magnesium, potassium, these are a challenge to get. They don't just come on pizza. And so you have to actually work your diet to include them. You have to make sure that you're eating things like fruits, vegetables, leafy greens, dark leafy greens, etc. That's the take-home message. I'm thinking, like, right now at this point at the end of the week, you're probably much more motivated to make sure that your diet is more based in whole foods, in fruits and vegetables than it had been. And so take advantage of this moment when you're feeling that motivation to try and make some changes that will last. Even little changes are better than zero changes. And so even if it's something like, I'm going to start eating some more spinach with butter and salt, which yum, or like kale in olive oil with some sea salt can be really delicious, depending on how you do it. Think about this is a good time. You're motivated, you're interested, you see the relevance. Before you get kind of immune to it, go ahead and make some of those changes. Hopefully that is something that you can find yourself doing, even if it's for the next few days. And we'll talk next week about medicinal herbs, and we're going to spend the last half of the class these last 3 weeks talking about medicinal herbs. So get your engines ready. Get your engines ready for doing the mini reports. What this means is you're going to look forward next week to the herbs that we're going to discuss, and you're going to choose one herb each day to do a mini report on. That mini report is detailed in your assignments. Should not take you very long. Should not take you very long. The purpose of that is I want you getting invested in the herbs we're talking about, knowing, recognizing a little bit beforehand. So when we start talking about it, for example, let's say we're going to talk about ashwagandha, and you've done a little mini report on ashwagandha, then it's not just this brand new thing that you have no context for. You already have a little bit of a context for it, and that will make it so much easier to learn about ashwagandha. So that's why I want you to do these mini reports so that you can learn more in those moments. See you next time. Have a great weekend, and I'm looking forward to everything, really. Take care.